So, my last video, it got blocked because of music, but I thought it was pretty funny. I pissed off this Christian named Smokey Saint, and I think I'll re-upload that without the copyright. Oh, hey, buddy. He's probably gonna try and eat me. But anyways, gonna start chapter 2 of the book I'm reading. I thought the conversation I had with I knew I was eventually going to piss off the Christians. They're so focused their hatred on the atheists that I flew under their radar for a little bit. But once they heard my opinions on Christianity, I was, of course, labeled a heretic. And I'm probably going to be exiled. That just shows you... that just proves I'm correct about Christians, though. If they exile me. Can you imagine? Wasn't Jesus completely about going to people who were exiled, like lepers and prostitutes? The chief forms. We have considered a number of flagrant contradictions. The question arises, how could they come about? How could there be such a subversion? What are the causes? What is the process? What are the stages of this perversion? Faced with this question, we are tempted to leave everything to the theologians and theology. At every point, it was the theologians who made the mistakes. Undoubtedly, the elaboration of rites, the religious character attributed to the Christian faith, this is what I have to deal with. Why don't eat me? Oh yeah. Eat that. Yeah. At every point, it was theologians who made the mistakes. Undoubtedly, the elaboration of rites, the religious character attributed to the Christian faith, its inclusion among great religious movements, the appearance of ideas totally alien to the Bible, such as purgatory, the intercession of saints, the multiplication of intercessors, penance, and auricular confession. All these things clearly have a theological origin. Church leaders and theologians are present at the point of departure. Yet two qualifications are necessary. I actually have to do something. This guy's bite this shit out of my feet. Aha. I outsmarted you. Okay. Church leaders and theologians are present at the point of departure. Yet two qualifications are necessary. The first is that theologians never expressly desired or taught ideas or dogmas directly contrary to revelation. Even heretics were always seeking honesty to render an account of what they took to be revelation. All that one can say is that originally the teaching was almost completely in conformity with the truth of God in Jesus Christ. Almost, because for some reason or other, whether intellectual or spiritual, there was a small addition, a slippery interpretation, an elation, an overemphasis on a particular theme, yet always very close to a correct understanding of the biblical text. This applies in such matters as the symbolism of the Mass, purgatory, the picture books of the unlearned, and the honor paid to martyrs. In the ensuing evolution, it is the mistake or elision that is the wrong aspect that achieves dominance. When there is in theological thinking an element of error, a fragment of ambiguity, some dredge of laxity or syncretism, these are the things that capture attention and become the focus of interest. These are the things that the Christian people have retained and prized. These have carried the day, increased in astonishing fashion, corrupted everything else, and gained the loyalty of believers, being adopted by them as though they were the truth of God. We seem to have here a fulfillment of prophecy of Jesus, that a little evil or error will corrupt the whole, like the leaven of the Pharisee. The responsibility of the clergy is incontestable. It is even more evident when we consider that this is the domain of faith, knowledge, and revelation, which, as we automatically transpose it for ourselves into thought, philosophy, or doctrine, and the biblical texts themselves undoubtedly speak about sound doctrine. It becomes an intellectual matter. We are so accustomed to thinking that conduct results from will or knowledge, that morality is made up of precepts that we have to apply, that quite spontaneously, when we confront such ab-formulated doctrine or elaborated theology. Yet we can no longer be content with this explanation, which has it that some theological mistake, however small, is the origin of every deviation and perversion. There are innumerable examples that we might analyze. Let us take just a few in the present context. First, and unquestionably, is an alliance with the powers. This did not occur merely when the Church received official recognition from Constantine, nor is it just a matter of ongoing Constantinianism. Christians and the Church have wanted an alliance with everything that represents power in the world. In reality, this rests on the conviction that thanks to the power of the Holy Spirit, the powers of this world have been vanquished and set in the service of the gospel, the Church, and mission. We must use their forces in the interests of evangelism. Wealth and various authorities receive recognition in this way and are put in the Church's service. But what happens is the exact opposite. The Church and mission are penetrated by the power and completely turned aside from their truth by the corruption of power. When Jesus says that his kingdom is not of this world, He says clearly what he intends to say. He does not validate any worldly kingdom, even if the ruler be a Christian. He puts us on guard against, or he does not validate any worldly kingdom, even if the ruler be a Christian. He puts us on guard against seeking any authority other than that of the Holy Spirit. Reciprocity has come into play. However, and a second set of factors has been introduced. Evangelical proclamation was essentially subversive. Put in danger by it, the forces of the social body have replied by integrating this power of negation, of challenge, by absorbing it through so disguising themselves that Christian thought had been a social transformation. But this was in fact a mere semblance. It concealed the persistence of the assimilative force of a society that wanted to remain essentially the same. In reality, the social group that gave strong adherence to Christianity, the political, social, and intellectual elite, brought with them a social ritual that was the exact opposite of what Jesus proclaimed. By way of simplification, let us say that they brought a legal spirit, Roman, a philosophical interpretation of the world, Greek, a mode of action, political, and an aggregate of interests. Fundamentally, one might say schematically that the social body that had been effectively threatened by the diffusion of a faith that bordered on anarchism, on a total lack of interest in worldly matters, administration, commerce, etc., on the promotion of a new mode of fellowship, reacted in self-defense and absorbed the foreign body, making it serve its own ends. Progressively, then, the church was led to see that it had to adapt to the truth of Jesus Christ to different cultures. It refused to enter into open warfare with the religious, intellectual, and social trends within the empire. It abandoned the radicalism of Jesus and the prophets. It adapted its message to different cultures. It modified the content of the word entrusted to it. This was the triumph of what signifies over what is signified. From the 4th century onward, then, there took place what some have called the paganizing of the church. It adopted beliefs and customs alien to the gospel. It faced the hard question of discerning whether political and social life were legitimate. Seduced, surrounded, and penetrated by a kind of fifth column, it finally pronounced them legitimate. It changed the pagan emperor cult into a veritable Christian cult, chiefly at Byzantium. It took in popular beliefs, adopted and Christianized pagan myths, confiscated pagan temples and made them into churches. It did this without realizing at all that the secret but true result would be the destruction of the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. And as the church still had very strongly the sense that it held the one and only truth, and had a kind of obsession with unity, a spiritual unity corresponding to the visible unity of the empire, it could not tolerate diversity in the expression of faith. It had to establish unity at all costs, hence the persecution of heretics, which I'm a heretic, I guess. At the same time, the church felt it incumbent to absorb everything that seemed to be of intellectual or religious value in past society. This explains the tendency toward syncretism that began in the 3rd century and continues to this day in all the churches. The ideal was to make a synthesis between Christianity and what was strange, if not inimical to it. These various procedures led the church and Christians progressively to validate the very opposite of what had been revealed by God and the impulse given by Jesus Christ. Now the drama was as follows. It was impossible to erase totally what Jesus had said and done. He had given a number of models with unavoidable implications. Thus, he had given a new freedom, a new love, an expression of truth. That odd fact is, then, that a number of effects, consequences, and modalities of the Christian faith persisted even when the substance of the faith had disappeared or had been completely adulterated. Thus, a new morality developed that no longer had any basis. We find a new conception of the relation between authority and subject, a new exploiting of nature, a new relation between to know it and convert it. Things went so far that in the long run, for example, the lay state, democracy, and socialism could be regarded as normal expressions of Christianity, but of a Christianity that bears no further relation to Jesus Christ or to God. Feuerbach has fully explained all of this. We might consider that theology has been one of the factors in this perversion, but not the cause. We enter here into a whole complex of political, ideological, and sociological factors that we can only unfold schematically in the present context. We must begin with theology. We cannot go into detail or discuss the value of the great systems. We cannot take up the theology of Irenaeus, Ambrose, or Augustine, let alone the Greek fathers. I will not delve into the very modern quarrel between the normalities and the realists, or the normalists and the realists. I'm a realist. We shall not investigate Thomas Aquinas or Occam, and I will leave on the side Luther and Calvin, Newman and Kung. We have in all these so many correct and true thoughts covering so many errors and deviations. It seems to me that everything goes back to a phenomenal change in the understanding of revelation, namely, the transition from history to philosophy. I believe that all the errors in Christian thought go back to this. I might say that all the theologians I have named had correct thoughts, that their theology was true, but that all of them were caught in the philosophical circle and pose metaphysical problems. All seek an answer by way of ontological thinking. All regard the biblical text or known revelation as points of departure for philosophy, whether by translation into philosophical terms or as reference of thought. They had intellectual, metaphysical, and epistemological questions, and they adduced the biblical text with a view to providing a system of answers to their questions. They used the biblical text to meet their own needs instead of listening to what it really was. Even Calvin. Alas. I need a drink of water. What's up, bud? He likes the table. In other words, once the transition was made from history to philosophy, all that they said was completely correct and true. They expressed a profound and authentic faith marked by a concern for truth. Yet it was all completely falsified by the initial transition. This is why the deviations were stronger than the truth that they retained. Very soon they forgot the essential point, that God does not reveal by means of a philosophical system or a moral code or a metaphysical construction. He enters human history and accompanies his people. The Hebrew Bible, even in the wisdom books, is not a philosophical construction or a system of knowledge. It is a series of stories that are not myths intended to veil or unveil objective and abstract truths. Or it is a series of stories that are not myths intended to veil or unveil objective and abstract truths. These stories are one history, the history of the people of God, the history of God's agreements and disagreements with his people, the history of loyalty and disobedience. There is nothing else but history, temporal, not eternal, history, lay, not sacred, history, a history that tells us that God is with and for us, but that does not speak about God in himself or provide any theory about God. Like all human histories, the Bible is a book that is full of questions but never gives any answers. Or rather, the answer to is included in the history, and it has to do with us. Even the parts of the Hebrew Bible that seem more disembodied, such as the law, the statutes, and the legal formulations, still belong to the history. The law is never eternal or absolute. It is always bound to a given history. This book offers us eternal laws expressing the will of God, yet laws that are always historical. There is essential truth, which consists of the words such as the Ten Commandments, but these are not true in themselves like objective and neutral scientific laws. No matter who teaches them, scientific laws remain the same, because they are external and can be passed on, like a parcel to those who listen. Biblical law, however, is true only because it is God who speaks it. It draws its truth from God. If we detach it from the speaker, it is no more than a subject for discussion with some acceptable elements. This is why this law does not fall from heaven like the golden plates of the celebrated J. Smith. It is given in the course of an election and liberation as the attestation of a covenant. It cannot be separated from this series of events. The law is the point of the covenant and the starting point of a new history. It is never a sort of frozen code abstracted from existence. One can never make of it a legal system apart from the living, moving, and actual presence of him who calls himself the living God. But life can never be made into scientific doctrine and knowledge. This aspect continues and gains added emphasis with Jesus. To do his work, God does not send a book of metaphysics or a sacred book of Gnostic revelations, or a complete epistemological system, or a perfected wisdom. He sends a man. In relation to him, stories are told again that constitute a history. Even those who, like Paul and James, are more theoreticians than historians, carefully preserve the historical element as the touchstone of authenticity. All that they write has to do exclusively with the history of Jesus and those whom he summons to faith. The greatest theologian, John, in his gospel as well as his epistles and Revelation, always expresses his theology as a history. He does perfectly one of the things we mentioned in the introduction, using and reorientating Gnostic ideas in such a way as to rob them of their pretension and make them serve to explicate God's historical incarnation in Jesus Christ. In this regard, the last book refers to a history that is not the truth, but the only possible framework in which to understand and express the will of God. This is the mode that God has chosen to reveal himself to us, but we seize it all and completely change the framework so as to bring in our own system of questions and expressions. I am not saying that this was fated, it was accidental. Hebrew thought was sown in a field, nourished by Greek thought and Roman law. And then there's a huge footnote. A familiar example of the mutation to which Revelation was actually subjected is its contamination by the Greek idea of the immorality of the soul. I will briefly recall it. In Jewish thought, death is total. There is no immortal soul, no division of body and soul. Paul's thinking is Jewish in this regard. The soul belongs to the physical realm and is part of the flesh. The body is the whole being. In death, there is no separation of body and soul. The soul is as mortal as the body, but there is a resurrection. Out of the nothingness that human life becomes, God creates anew the being that was dead. This is a creation by grace. There is no immortal soul intrinsic to us. Greek philosophy, however, introduces among theologians the idea of the immortal soul. The belief was widespread in popular religion and it was integrated into Christianity. But it is a total perversion. Everything is not now dependent on the grace of God, and assurance of immortality comes to be evaluated by virtues and works. All Christian thinking is led astray by this initial mutation that comes through Greek philosophy and Near Eastern cults. An ardent work brings to light this type of deformation. Louis Rogier, in his French bullshit words, shows how belief in the soul's celestial immortality arose in the second half of the 5th century BC on the basis of astronomy. Pythagorean astronomy radically transformed the idea of the destiny of the soul held by Mediterranean peoples, for the notion of a vital breath that dissipates at death, for belief in a survival of shades wandering about in the subterranean realm of the dead. It substitutes the notion of a soul of celestial substance exiled in this world. This idea completely contaminates biblical thinking, gradually replaces the affirmation of the resurrection, and transforms the kingdom of the dead into the kingdom of God. Holy shit, that was a massive footnote. But very interesting. So the idea of an immortal soul comes from some Greek bullshit religion, in that when we die, we actually die, but there's like an essence of our existence that gets made into a new person, apparently. That's interesting. There was no need to translate the history into terms that the Greco-Roman world could understand, that is, into philosophical and legal terms. The Torah became the divine equivalent of the law of the 12 tables. God's revelation became the climax of the teaching of Socrates. What resulted was of decisive importance. The Bible was interpreted by the intellectual tools of Greek philosophy instead of listening to the text as it was. Theologians tried to draw from it a coherent philosophical system. It was put into the framework of a Platonic or an Aristotelian or any other system. Whether the system came from Heraclitus or Epicurus made no difference. It all came from the same thing. The biblical stories were treated as myths from which one had to draw some abstract universal thought. Some will tell me that we have no option but to use our available tools of knowledge even to understand a history. This is true. But I reply that Hebrew thought had its own tools of knowledge that are fully set forth in the language. We should bow and submit and convert to these instead of forcing God's revelation into the straitjacket of Greco-Roman thinking, instead of putting it on its bed of Procrustes in this cage of tigers. Shit. I think I'm gonna call it there. I'm getting kind of tired. I'm gonna eat. Word. It's a cool book though. I'm liking it. Oh god, I'm getting attacked. Speaking of a den of tigers. Jeez. Why are you eating me? I love you. I thought we were friends. I trusted you. I trusted you.